I will be essentially presenting today are a few readings of what actually Dandan has called the increasingly deformed echoes of Herodotus's original passage on Zalmoxis. When Tom first asked me to give the paper here, I thought that, well, Thracian religion as a whole would be a suitable case for a helpline talk, but obviously it is just far too large for a single paper, and Zalmoxis was clearly used as a kind of shorthand by many subsequent authors in addressing and explaining what were thought of as Thracian or indeed more generalized northern religious particularities. So it might be sensible to indeed take the Zalmoxian angle today into this. There is plenty of material as it is. You see some of it, most of it, on your handouts as well. Also, the reuse and adaptation of Zalmoxis seems to be quite indicative of some of the broader patterns of the reception of Herodotus's ethnographically framed material. If ethnographical thinking and writing is about things to do with other people, in both senses of the expression, then one gets quite easily the impression that the later ancient reception of Herodotus's Getic disciples of Zalmoxis is more about what to use other people for. Many of the ideas I'm presenting today are in some shape or form part of a book manuscript I'm currently developing, and for Tom H, we'll be hearing much stuff that he's already had to read. He's kindly been commenting on my manuscript during the past few months, so apologies to him. So first in your handout, I have quite simply given the three main Herodotian passages, though these are, of course, generally quite well known. For all we know, and as many scholars such as Chavdar Marinov and others have pointed out, the Herodotian passages are quite incontestably the very beginning of the Zalmoxian tradition. When writing about Thracians, Herodotus states on 3 different occasions that the Getai are Thanatidzuzi. This first comes up when he mentions that unlike several other Thracian groups, the Getai, whom he calls the bravest and most just of Thracians, resisted the Persian march to the east very, very stubbornly. The connection between the Getic beliefs and their bravery is not stated in the text, but it seems pretty solidly implied. In 494, Herodotus notes that what is denoted by this Athanatidzuzi is the Getic belief in themselves not dying, but that anyone who perishes will go to Zalmoxis, who is also called Gebeleitsis and who is denoted as a daimon. The expression Athanatidzuzi has, of course, been translated in a huge variety of ways, but broadly speaking, I suppose it bifurcates between claiming themselves to be immortal or believing themselves to be immortal, possibly also making themselves immortal in some form or another. Herodotus next offers an illustration of this belief in the ritual sphere. In 4-year intervals, the Getai select by lot a human messenger to Zalmoxis, whom they then throw at 3 upright spears. If the victim is not killed, this is deemed to signify their worthlessness, and another one is chosen. Perhaps Herodotus intended the timing and the aim of the ritual to suggest the Greek Olympiads and to represent a bizarre barbarian way of finding the best individuals among themselves. As already Francois Artaud observed, the striking thing about the Getic ritual killing is the complete absence of a Herodosian narrator. He offers no witnesses, no comments, nor any additional knowledge. Also, at the end of this section, in a rather puzzling and multi-layered claim, these same Thracians, which probably means the Getai, are also said to deny the existence of any other gods except their own and try to attack thunder with their weapons and insults. So following this pattern of first, ethnicized statement, secondly, cultic illustration of the belief, and thirdly, an ideology for that belief, Herodotus then goes on in 495 to give an explanation about the origins of the Getic belief in immortality, which he attributes to Hellespontan and Pontic Greeks. Having been a slave of Pythagoras, and by means of his acquired wealth and Hellenic culture, so much higher in comparison with the Thracians, Zalmoxis was able to convince this rather simple-minded hypaphronesteroi, people who lived wretchedly, akopioi, about the truth of his claims of immortality. In lavish feasts, he addresses the chiefs of the Getae and inculcates in them the belief that if they follow his creed, they and their heirs would continue to live in an eternal, bounteous afterlife. Zalmoxis even sets up a ruse in order to prove his own immortality. He disappears for 3 years into a pre-prepared subterranean chamber and then stages his resurrection afterwards. As already Mircea Eliade and Willard Trask in the 70s noted, it is unclear why the Thracians would have concluded that Zalmoxis was dead, since they were unable to find his body. But the simplicity and the cultural primitiveness of the Thracians is the only piece of causative commentary that Herodotus offers in this section, which otherwise differs from his typical way of referring to either witnesses, his own authorial judgment, or other sources. Apart from causation, however, Herodotus does offer his own comment on the plausibility of Zalmoxis' story in 496, where he notes that he neither fully believes nor disbelieves the story of the underground chamber, but at least it seems to him that Zalmoxis, if he was a person and not a daimon to begin with, would have lived long before Pythagoras. This latter caution, interestingly, and as we will see, was tossed rather gleefully aside in the subsequent reception. Aside from the Zalmoxis story explaining the Getic belief, other Thracians are within the histories described as similarly holding beliefs about the afterlife that most people in Herodotus' Greek audience would probably have thought of as extreme or non-normative. The three groups of Getae, Trausoi, and those living above the Crestonians are all defined as different in their beliefs from the rest of the Thracians. Notably, in each of the three cases, the Thracian non-normativity manifests itself in beliefs about death and afterlife. At the outset of Book 5, Herodotus elaborates regarding the Thracian religion by noting that Trausoi differ from all other Thracians because they lament their newborn and then rejoice at burials. This might imply a belief in the same kind of blessed afterlife as the Getae, though the idea that birth is evil was also a long-standing topos attributed to vaunted Greek figures such as Solon, also by Herodotus himself. In any case, the reversed rites of passage topos became a widely attributed motif and mentioned in connection with many European barbarian groups in the subsequent reception. The Thracians living above the Crestonians, on the other hand, are polygynous, and there is much competition among a dead man's widows for the honor of being sacrificed at the funeral pyre by having her throat cut. Interestingly, unlike in the Getic ritual killing with the spears, where the terminology of human sacrifice is absent, such terms are present in this Thracian widow sacrifice description. Now, essentially, Herodotus portrays Thracians as violent and lacking any kind of apprehension about death, crucially perhaps, with the religion of the Getae in particular not only directed against everyone else's gods quite aggressively, but possibly also based on a ruse. As Herodotus wrote in 494, these same Thracians, indeed, as I already mentioned, shoot arrows upwards towards thunder and lightning. These same Thracians, probably meaning the Getae, and they utter threats to the divinity involved. This aside is, of course, puzzling in its internal logic, as many scholars already, François Hartog also pointed out. Zalmoxis is introduced as a daimon. He is not explicitly equated to a theos, while the Thracians, denying any other theos than their own, still threaten with arrows the heavenly theos. Both the arrow shooting and the belief in Zalmoxis in 494 are in fact conveyed by the roughly equally distancing verb nomidzusi. It nonetheless emerges as an overall impression that the Getic fanaticism about their strange religion is reinforced by ignorance, and besides their human sacrifices, they are prone to deny the validity and existence of other people's divinities. So that then was how Herodotus used Zalmoxis to help exemplify and explain the Thracian religion. But I would still perhaps like to offer a few observations on the original before we move to its reception. The Getic passage of Herodotus became very influential during the subsequent tradition, as I hope to demonstrate later today. And this might indeed have been helped along by the fact that this ethnographical snippet or snapshot is particularly timeless in its framing. Artaud noted the immediacy of the present tense in the section. It emphasizes how the Getae have always thought, believed, and done, and will continue to think, believe, and do forever, the quotation from him. In Herodotus, such an example of an ethnographical narrator's omniscience and the categorical nature of ethnically framed customs may be comparatively rare, but it is notable that in the subsequent literary tradition, this stasis came to characterize almost the whole Thracian macro region. In Greco-Roman ethnographical writings, it was, of course, not only the Thracians who were routinely described as ignorant or disrespectful of other people's gods, but they did remain connected to ideas of bizarrely strongly held religious notions, often with some extreme real-life results, either in cult or other kind of behavior. There is something else quite interesting in the narrative structure of Herodotus' Zalmoxis and his apotheosis among the Getae. A recent article by Gianluca Miniaci, it's in your bibliography, has discussed the way in which encounter narratives in colonizing or imperialist settings can lead to a story type among the encountering society about the encountered society, taking the arrivals for divine beings. Miniaci's examples, he's an Egyptologist, so his examples are the Egyptian visitors to the land of Punt in Eastern Africa during the reign of Hatshepsut, then the Spanish conquerors of several indigenous American societies, and lastly, I suppose a classical case, Captain Cook among the Hawaiians. Common to all these encounters was that the mind reading of the natives by the explorers / invaders / conquerors tended to imagine themselves as being taken for gods. Miniaci calls this a counterfeit emic notion. It pretends to represent the ideas of the encountered society, but in fact stems wholly from the dynamics of colonizer looking at the colonized, looking at the colonizer. Now, Miniaci's interpretation eventually goes the cognitive route and says that this is a universal pattern, which in some ways is no doubt true, but on the other hand, I feel is a bit of a no-starter, at least with such a small sample. But what I began wondering immediately after reading this article was whether there is not something a bit similar, at least, to this, in the way in which Herodotus narrates Zalmoxis' successful ruse among the Thracians. He has started off as a slave, a natural condition to Thracians in the eyes of the Greeks, as Asheri, Lloyd, and Corcella have pointed out in their commentary. And I also think Dandana is quite right in pointing out the way that Herodotus emphasizes this condition by doubling the verb douleusai in the passage. But Zalmoxis gains his eventual freedom, gains wealth, although this is just the one step on his trajectory. The Thracians do end up taking him for a divine being. And this is implied to derive from the disparity between the backwardness of the Thracians and the advanced toolkit of Zalmoxis, in this case, both philosophical and material. I feel that a more advanced culture's self-regard could, in addition to any potential cognitive processes, could be enough of an explanation for scenarios that imagine the more primitive encountered society as ready to believe in the divinity of the encounterer. And this would bear some similarity with what Herodotus wrote, I put forth, at least as a sort of quick association. In 495, in particular, the contrast between the poverty and backwardness of Thracians and Zalmoxis' acquired, quote, Ionian ways and more advanced way of life than that of the Thracians is much emphasized. In fact, since the Ionian is here not simply a synonym for the advanced Greek mode of life, one might even take this as a reference to philosophical, theoretical, or rhetorical upper hand. So not only does Zalmoxis dazzle the Thracians with his material wealth, but he is able to run circles around their conceptual thinking. He blows their minds, and in so doing becomes a daimon. In his sections about Thracians, Herodotus balances distancing and familiarizing gestures about their religion. Distancing elements include, for instance, the way in which Book 9 he tells that a Persian fugitive, Oyobatzos, was caught by the Thracian Absinthians and sacrificed to their god Pleistoros in an indigenous ritual. This type of genuinely ethnic-sounding divinities although they are not too common in Herodotus as such, were naturally suitable for giving a logos about the foreign people its requisite color. They acted as an authenticating detail. Familiarizing elements, on the other hand, include a detail that later became a commonplace of ethnographic literature, the list of most worshipped gods, presented through a kind of interpretatio. The Thracians, for instance, are said to only worship Ares, Dionysus, and Artemis, but unlike the rest of them, their royalty worships Hermes more than any other divinity, as they regard him as their ancestor and only make vows to him. These divinities communicated a certain set of cultural and societal assumptions to the audience, or more appropriately, conformed with their already existing imagery. Ares, Dionysus, and Artemis encapsulate the three principal pursuits of Herodotus' Thracians: war, banquets, and hunting. This points out how Herodotus' audience had already formed a set of impressions about Thracians. He was by no means describing a new society, and in this case, in this sense, it does not really fit this Miniacis encountering narrative, though I would argue that it doesn't really need that first encounter as a motif necessarily. But Thrace was, for Athenians of Herodotus' generation, the most significant region of the northern Near Abroad in many ways. So I'm postponing this reception part, but before heading properly speaking into the reception part, it is perhaps worth reviewing very briefly what Herodotus' predecessors and close contemporaries wrote about the same figure. Well, in fact, it is only contemporaries. In Herodotus, the Getae adopted a belief in afterlife, and notably not reincarnation, based on a foreigner's application of Pythagoras' ideas. In contrast with the later tradition, the Herodosian form of the Getic belief or claim regarding their own immortality cannot have seemed particularly Pythagorean to observers with at least some degree of familiarity with Pythagorean doctrines. Initiations guaranteeing better afterlife were very familiar in Athens around Herodotus' time. Not only the Eleusinian mysteries, but also the Orpheotelestai plying their trade made sure of this. Maybe even Zalmoxis' charlatanry towards the Thracian chiefs was veiled criticism of the widespread fashion of heeding freelance initiators into the mysteries. In the face of the subsequent tradition, it is worthwhile to note that Herodotus does not call Zalmoxis' doctrines Pythagorean either. The only implied connection is that his prior association with Pythagoras and Ionian ways gave Zalmoxis the tools to pull off his ruse. Of course, it may be that what really mattered for Herodotus' audience was that the Thracians held non-normative and implausible views regarding their fate after death, and importantly, that these made them exceptionally brave. The beliefs attributed to Thracians can be interpreted as a thought exercise, certainly bearing some resemblance to sophistic exercises and even the Nomima Barbarica tradition. Thought exercise in what a barbarized variant of such doctrines about afterlife would result in. Among warlike northerners, the bellicose bravery in the face of death surely seemed like an apt reflection of a belief in a blessed afterlife, though among the Greek followers of the mystery cults, this was hardly the principal manifestation. The Herodosian ethnographical material about Thracian cave-centered apotheosis of mortals is echoed in another register by the 4th century play Rhesus, transmitted together with the Euripidean corpse. After Rhesus's murder, in Troy that is, a muse comforts grieving Hector by telling him that she would intercede on behalf of the Thracian king and ask Persephone to release his soul, Psyche Anaenai, so that Rhesus would become a man-god, Anthropodaimon, living in a silver-rich cave, a neat, ethnicizing, localizing detail that silver there, very much in tune with Athenians would have thought about Thrace around that time. Konstantin Rabadjev has suggested that the description of Rhesus becoming an Anthropodaimon shows that Greeks were aware of a qualitative difference between their ideas of dead heroes and those held by Thracians. A simpler explanation would perhaps be that the worship of such a dead hero would be enough to denote the figure as an Anthropodaimon, a term which, by the way, is essentially a hapax legomenon. This would be especially true if his soul had been released, presumably from its traditional epic localization of languishing in the realm of Hades. It was not unheard of for heroes to become daimones and to continue to interact with the mortals. This could perhaps be also why Herodotus chose to call Zalmoxis a daimon for the Getai, the interaction. After Herodotus, Zalmoxis was taken up by Plato in his early dialogue Charmides, where Socrates entwines a reference to the physicians of the Thracian king Zalmoxis into a metaphorical argument about a kind of holistic approach to curing ignorance. The Platonic reference has been considered largely fictional, I think quite rightly, certainly internal to Greek discourse. But the reference to Zalmoxis as a god and a king, as well as the detail of immortality, could stem from an early stage of involution on the same information that Herodotus included. But I do feel that the Herodosian, more strictly Herodosian dependence is emphasized by the repetition of the expression hoi legontai kai ap athanatidzein, where the ap athanatidzein might have the force of making themselves immortal through ritual action. So it seems fairly uncontroversial that by the late classical era, Thrace had emerged as a localization for noteworthy beliefs about the afterlife and in particular about immortality. The connection of the Thracians and the Getai with beliefs concerning life after death was emerging as an established detail of the ethnographic tradition about the Balkan groups. Most of the time, the Herodosian influence is clear enough. This is evident, for instance, in the way in which Photius's 9th century lexicon cites the text Nomima Barbarica by Herodotus's younger contemporary Hellanicus of Lesbos. The Zalmoxis story here is almost identical contents-wise with that of Herodotus. Of course, that's in your handout as well. The only elaboration is the use of the ethnic names of Terizoi and Krobuzoi as two groups who believe, in addition to the Getai, I suppose, that those who have died will depart like Zalmoxis, but will come back again. While this attestation in Photius's lexicon is very late, it at least does give some sort of indication as to the purported nature of the beliefs. These Thracians were apparently thought to believe that they would be reborn back into the land of the living. So we do have a rearrangement of the Herodosian information, seemingly perhaps more in line with what the Thracians would have seen Zalmoxis doing in that same Herodosian scenario. It also shows that Herodotus' account was picked up by contemporary writers who applied small tweaks and changes into it. Again, on the basis of Photius, Hellanicus had described Zalmoxis as having been of Greek extraction and said that he had revealed mysteries about eternal life to the Getai, although these are not defined, these mysteries are not defined as explicitly Pythagorean yet at this stage. Photius also quotes the Hellenistic rationalizing mythogeographer Mnasias of Patara about Zalmoxis being the Thracian name for Kronos. So one can start to see that this material was too good not to be elaborated, and by Hellenistic era it had clearly gotten well underway. In the high imperial doxographer Diogenes Laertius's Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, Zalmoxis, again that variant of the name, Zalmoxis the Thracian joins Mokhos the Phoenician and Atlas the Libyan into a trio, thus helping Diogenes to pick out one individual representative sage for each continent and representing the supposed barbarian origins of philosophy in Europe. Supposed because Diogenes in the end does not endorse this belief or theory. There is no doubt that Zalmoxis was still in this later context, Diogenes' context, the best known individually named Northern holy man. His possible charlatanism having become somewhat subdued by this time of the reception, by that point. But the sources mentioned by Diogenes are mostly Hellenistic, such as Hermippus of Smyrna, pupil of Callimachus. Hermippus had written of Pythagoras constructing an underground house upon arriving in Italy and using it to spread belief in his divinity. Hermippus is further quoted by Josephus in his Against Apion as having written that some of Pythagoras's precepts were, quote, in imitation of the beliefs of the Jews and the Thracians. So it seems that for whatever purpose, and it may well have been partly satirical, Hermippus was casting a wider comparative eye, certainly ranging further than merely Thrace, but it also may be that he narrated Pythagoras' subterranean dwelling with the same implication, that Pythagoras was in fact copying Zalmoxis. Despite the reversal, the detail itself seems to depend only fully on the Herodotian Zalmoxis story. So over the course of the long Hellenistic age, I rather like that term which Angelos Haniotis is using nowadays quite a lot, long Hellenistic age. The role of Zalmoxis and other hereditary priests among the Thracians and other Balkan groups kept on being repeated. Although the Thracian bravery also seemed to be a natural result of their beliefs, another strain of anecdotes envisioned a very Zalmoxian sort of deceptions, where Thracian leaders would manipulate their troops' inherent superstitious nature. An example can be found in Polyaenos' later 2nd century report, probably based on an unidentified Hellenistic source. It deals with the Thracian Kebreni and Sukaiboiai, who used to elect their war leaders from among the priests of Hera. Their priest general Kosingas, being faced with unrest among his ranks, manages to overcome this rebelliousness by building a set of massive ladders, affixing them all together, and putting forth word about his intention to climb to the heavens to tell Hera about his troops' disobedience. The Thracians, quote, being stupid and senseless, anoetoi kai alogoi, were terrified by this threat and backed down. Such ideas, traditional though they were, continued to be part of the proverbial character of Thracians during the Higher Empire. I think at this point it might be fun to jump to the Latin side of things for a bit. And I do not want to over-argue this Caesar bit, but I, on the other hand, don't want to leave it out either. For this part of Herodosian reception, of course, the language gap, the lack of explicit verbal similarities, and the lack of pressure towards authors to mention a well-known text like Herodotus' Histories by name do, of course, complicate the exact definition of reception in any narrow way. But his work and a good selection of episodes in it would have been well known to the educated members of the Roman elite. Felix Racine does know that although direct knowledge of the histories is difficult to demonstrate in the Latin literature, this does not necessarily preclude an awareness of the most memorable episodes of Herodotus' work. Now, of course, I'm well aware that what follows is not much of an argument really, but it would be quite difficult to see how somebody like Julius Caesar, for instance, educated on Rhodes and elsewhere, would not have known about quite a good amount of Herodosian episodes. Topoi that derived some of their influence from having been used, if not first, then at their early stage of reception by Herodotus, are more than likely in Caesar and have been noticed by several scholars. These include, for instance, the topos of finding luxurious, degenerating furnishings from the camp of a defeated eastern enemy, in Caesar's case, of course, the Pompeians, but also the descriptions of battling elusive barbarian enemies, where the influential origin episode is, of course, Herodotus' Book 4 on Darius' Scythian campaign, passages such as 446, for instance. So I suppose I would like to suggest quite meekly and without putting too much pressure on the point that Caesar's druids as manipulative agents among the Gauls, convincing them of their immortality, could bear in some ways a certain generic similarity to Herodotus' Zalmoxis among the Getae. It could thus be counted to represent the outer rims, so to speak, of Herodosian reception, and it certainly was significant for the subsequent developments in terms of immortality beliefs among northern groups. It certainly gets entangled into the subsequent Herodosian reception quite clearly. Book 6 of Caesar's Commentaries of the Gallic War described the Gauls as very dedicated to ritual observations. It also claimed that the Gauls were being persuaded by the Druids about their souls not perishing at death, but that they would be indeed moved from ones to others after death. The Druids purposefully propagate this belief in immortality of the souls, or indeed transmigration of souls, in order to make Gauls more fearsome as warriors. It is within a very clearly flagged ethnographical section of Book 6, which treats Gauls through several of the same categories which Herodotus had used about Thracians in Book 4. Other similarities, in addition to the immortality detail and the manipulative religious agents, include the listings of most worshipped divinities in 6.17, which mentions Mercury, interestingly, as the most popular one, perhaps comparably to how Hermes was the divinity of Thracian aristocracy in Herodotus. But it also perhaps is good to mention the detail which precedes the mention of the immortality doctrine, the fact that these doctrines are not put into writing. As you know, Herodotus mentions that all the circumpontic peoples are most unlearned, and only Anacharsis is a sage coming from that area. But indeed, what is unequivocally stated by Caesar is the corollary of this doctrine. The belief was considered to efficiently enable virtus by allowing the warriors to forget their fear of death. To the Romans, whose stereotypes about Gallic ferocia had been shaped by their narratives of hostile relations, this was an elegant explanation that dovetailed with their own epistemic base. Just like Herodotus' Zalmoxis deceived the Getic chiefs, so do the Druids in Caesar seem to primarily manipulate the Gallic equites in order to inculcate heedlessness in the face of death. Among Caesar's Germani, though, there is no indication yet that any religious experts were envisioned as propagating a belief in immortality. This did change in the subsequent tradition, though, when the motif became applied quite broadly among the commonality of northern barbarians. The broad homogeneity of the northern barbarian peoples in the Greek and Roman minds ensured that whenever real-life historical behavior had to be explained, the same acts of mind reading could be attempted. Arrian of Nicomedia still wrote quite conventionally about peoples along the Ister, most of whom are Celtic, and particularly among them that the Getae hold the doctrine of immortality. But around the same time, Appian of Alexandria used the idea of northerners deriving their lack of fear from their belief in anabiosis, the return to life, when writing about the late Republican wars against Ariovistus's Germans. Both Arrian's and Appian's ethnic attributions show not only the lasting haziness between the geographical and ethnic groupings of Keltoi and Germanoi among the Greek writers, but also the easy transfer of a motif with explanatory power between different groups of northerners, a major feature in the broader reception of the Herodosian Zalmoxis and the beliefs he had inculcated. If we move on to Strabo, we see how the Thracian religiosity on the whole, and within this assemblage also Zalmoxis' role, was prone to be updated in the early imperial context. In a bid to prove himself a more able Homerist than Posidonius of Rhodes was, Strabo gets into a long discussion on the groups of Moesia and Thracia, which the Rhodian polymath seems to have treated. Strabo takes up the apparently Posidonian idea that the strength of the Getic devotion to religious matters was somehow noteworthy or exceptional. Next, perhaps to further illuminate the idea of Getae being particularly fervent in their religiosity, Strabo tells his version of the story of Zalmoxis, whose name, again, he spells in the Zalmoxis fashion. Strabo's story exhibits some departures from the Herodosian one, which I think are really interesting and telling. Both the geographical and chronological horizons are more extended, befitting Strabo's Augustan Tiberian context. Zalmoxis had not only learned astral knowledge from his former master Pythagoras, but he had also learned it firsthand from the Egyptians. After his return to Thrace, his tribe and its rulers were so impressed by his facility in making predictions from signs that he eventually reached the status of co-ruler. His position as the high priest also elided into being addressed as a god himself. This elaborated form of the Zalmoxis story feels like it suited well in the late Republic and early imperial context, and may even be a comment on how Caesar, a general calendar reformer, Pontifex Maximus, had by Strabo's time become Divus Iulius. Strabo explains further that Zalmoxis had also moved to live in a remote cave, This distance made him more revered by the population, thus even more influential and useful in the eyes of the king, who was one of the few people he met with. From the holiness of this person, the entire mountain where he lived became considered sacred. So the ideology is thus extended not only to ethnography and ritual life, as in Herodotus' case, but even to topography. The angle is shifted from the Herodotian story of deception into what might rather be called something like an institutional euhemeristic take. This power-sharing deal, Strabo notes, had persisted into our own times, his own times, with men of suitable character successively adopting the mantle of the living god among the Getae. Later on, after declaring that he wants to pass over the early history of the Getae and speak about the actual condition, in 7.3.11, Strabo details the rise of Burebistas. Decaeneus, his accomplice, is called an andra goeta, sorcerer, and described as having wandered through Egypt and soon having achieved the status of a living deity, like Zalmoxis, a parallelism which Strabo explicitly mentions. The Thracians seem to keep on repeating the same deification pattern, which is quite interesting. Another obvious read application is the role of oracular or predictive prowess in gaining the veneration of Thracians. Both Zalmoxis and Decaeneus do this. Notably, Strabo contextualizes Burebistas by referring to Caesar's plans against Dacians. An expectation of stiff resistance is certainly implied, and once again, this seems connected to the Getic or Dacian belief in rebirth. A contemporary clash with these northerners and the manipulative religious elite must have seemed inevitable to Strabo. This brought relevance to the historical exemplum of the Getic lack of fear, already mentioned, of course, by Herodotus, regarding their resistance to Persia. And indeed, we see this pattern repeating itself for the third time. The next major horizon is when Trajan's policies and warlike expansion led to actual clashes with the Dacians, and the reapplication of the idea of a manipulative Thracian elite was projected onto Dacian leaders. Statilius Crito of Heraclea Salvace described in his Getica how the kings of the Getae used tricks and goeteia to foster desidaimonia among their followers. So it was a very useful motif. The Herodotian Northerners continued to be useful, though very hazily distinguished horizon for discussions on immortality, deification, and ethnic cults among the 2nd century sophists. I'd like to take Lucian as an example. He mentions a rather interchangeably Thracian or Scythian oath-taking in 2 different instances. In Toxaris 38, the eponymous Scythian swears in the name of wind and sword, ton anemon kaiton akinaken. The sword seems like it's lifted from the archive of ethnographicizing imagery that Herodotus used first in his Skythicos logos, but it is also mentioned together with Zalmoxis in Lucian's other piece called Scythian, where 2 members of this ethnos meet in Athens and have an imaginary dialogue. Anacharsis beseeches Toxaris to be his guide and tutor by swearing upon our ancestral gods, Akinakes and Zalmoxis. Toxaris is said to have died in Athens and to still receive sacrifices under the name of Xenos Iatros, foreign physician. In thanks, a white horse is annually sacrificed on his tomb, which then Lucian goes on to ekphrastically describe, and to compare this kind of deification to what he calls a Scythian habit of making mortals immortal and sending them to be companions of Zalmoxis. So clearly it is the Herodotian Zalmoxis that he refers to, but the slippage between Scythians and Thracians is a telling example of the capaciousness of the ethnographical set of images about the Northerners and the free way in which elements in it could be reattributed and used as evidence in this riper stage of the archival formation. Barbarian rituals and holy men could also provide extraordinary and hence remarkable scenes and details to serve as the basis of ekphrases for the sophists. That is also seen in Lucian's Scythian. Also, it's perhaps worth noting that Lucian's rough contemporary Celsus seems to have, based of course on origin, seems to have referred to the worship of Zalmoxis in Scythia, which just reinforces the impression of the second sophistic treating Zalmoxis as a freely applicable figure between Thracians and Scythians. Finally, there are a few instances of Zalmoxian reception from the High to later empire that I would like to talk about today. I've been recently thinking about the ways in which the universalizing brush of high imperial doxographical listings tended to draw connections between different groups of barbarians, and what did this mean to the broader contours in which the traditional information from the ethnographic archive of knowledge was rearranged. The great heresiological compendium, Refutatio Omnium Heresium, also known as Philosophumena, has traditionally been attributed to Hippolytus of Rome. Whether this is exact or not, the dating of the text to early 3rd century is nonetheless fairly secure. In another significant testimony to the way in which the different northern groups could be mixed and connected, Zalmoxis is showcased in Philosophumena as the transmitter of Pythagoras' discipline to the Celtic Druids, who in turn, quote, examined the Pythagorean philosophy to its apex after receiving it from him. Now, this makes great sense in terms of authors trying to envision doxographic pedigrees, diadochai, between Pythagoras, Thracians, and Gauls, all of whose beliefs in rebirth or life after death in some vague way had become proverbial and widely recognizable. In a way, while it was clear in Herodotus that the Getic understanding of Zalmoxis' propagated beliefs was imperfect, erroneous, or at least based on a deception, by this stage, the pedigree of the doctrine among barbarians, initiated by Zalmoxis without any reference to bad faith on his part, has even led to a qualitative high point. Like the Philosophumena, Iamblichus's De Vita Pythagorica too mentions the survival of Pythagorean doctrines through Zalmoxis' proselytizing among the northern barbarians, though he is more accommodating with ethnonyms, referring to the Getai, Galatai, and Tralles. Tralles, the last ethnonym, has usually been understood as Triballoi, the Triballians, another Balkan group. And all these three groups are said to hold beliefs about the indestructibility of souls. Now, what is striking in Iamblichus's account is that the widespread adoption of the belief in a rewarding afterlife among a wide array of barbarians does not need to be explained, unlike in Herodotus's time. It is presented as a natural outcome from Zalmoxis' teaching among the Getai, just like in the Philosophumena, it did not need to be explained how the Thracian Zalmoxis originated Pythagoreanism among the Celtic Druids. What is significant is the uncomplicated assumption of diffusion of the doctrine that in Herodotus' account was presented as something distinctly Getic, or at least referred to as being held by only a fraction of Thracians. Iamblichus's passage is also interesting for the way, and I in a way love this in it, it's also interesting for the way in which ideas about apotheosis and isotheoitimai are so clearly the products of its own high imperial context, where founders and benefactors of all kinds were frequently offered isotheoitimai, honors equal to the gods. Similarly, the Greek city communities and Getai alike are called primarily politai in the passage, which moreover highlights this impression of Zalmoxis as just an early example of a local benefactor whose apotheosis was just deserts from his euergesia and law writing. Iamblichus's predecessor Porphyry of Tyre, following the mention of a possibly supernatural figure called Astraios as Pythagoras' foster brother and disciple, had reported Zalmoxis as, quote, another youthful disciple from Thrace and Pythagoras' beloved pupil. Named for the Thracian word for bearskin, Zalmos, Zalmoxis became the chosen recipient of the Pythagorean teachings about sacred rites and the nature of gods, so very specifically cultic or ritual or theological angle. Zalmoxis, according to some, says Porphyry, was also called Thales and worshipped by the barbarians as Heracles. This fascinating but frustratingly short euhemeristic note reinforces the view that through the accretion of written traditions, the Greek cultural heroes and mythical figures could have become even more broadly applied within the ambit of the supposed antiquities of barbarian peoples than had been the case during the Hellenistic era. Mnasias of Patara's Kronos attribution has now been joined by Heracles, who of course was a well-known traveler in the north already in Herodotus' Book 4. In comparison to Iamblichus's account, Zalmoxis in Porphyry's story seems also much less of a figure of Roman imperial era provincial euergesia and bears more of a resemblance to the way in which he was represented, for instance, in Hellanicus's fragment that we saw earlier from the Hellenistic era. Just before the passage quoted in the handout, Porphyry had referred to Pythagoras' miraculous foster child, Astraeus, basing the mention of this figure on Antonius Diogenes' 1st or 2nd century novel, Incredible Things Beyond Thuleeta, Hyper Thuleen Apista. This indicates that the Zalmoxian reception was carried on not only by the doxographic register, but also through works like aretalogical novels, which in turn could feed back into doxography. In Antonius Diogenes' novel, the resume of which has been thankfully preserved by Photius, Astraeus travels to meet Zalmoxis among the Getae in what seems like a plainly Herodosian pastiche. It has been suggested that Pythagoreanism could have been a device meant to impart a measure of respectability to the Apista. But more than that, it seems to me that the Apista takes full advantage of the vast circuits of mobility that the Thracian, South Italian, and more vaguely northern connections of Pythagoras opened up. Dane Dana has argued that the Zalmoxis as a Pythagorean, and I quote, aduceum plus de exotism ensemblului, adds exoticism to the whole. The evocative but ethnographically underpopulated northern sections of the inhabited world could be used as an edge-of-the-world staging area where innovative narratives could be localized and where Greek doctrines could find proponents among the barbarians. This in itself is not unlike what Herodotus does, though perhaps his Skythikos Logos is a better example of that. Oh, sorry, I quite forgot to change my slide. So here is the Porphyry slide and Antonius Diogenes slide. That was very silly of me. I'll leave you just a moment to read it and I'll have a sip of water. Right, yes. Now, Scythia, speaking of Scythians, and now we do go to the next slide. Of course, I will put this up on my academia.edu page as well if somebody is really that interested. So, speaking of Scythians, a fascinating example of using Scythianness as a metaphor for a primitive stage of religious practices can be found from Epiphanius of Salamis' Panarion, the medicine chest. Epiphanius presents a three-age model for the generation of different human religious and anthropological errors, and in so doing elevates Scythian superstition into the role of one of the four fundamental heresies, each covering a distinct era and introducing a range of religious creeds and practices, which Epiphanius then imagines as developing into ethnic customs, nomima barbarica, if you will. In the Scythian age, as in the preceding age of barbarism, each person would be clearly either godly or impious. There were no mixtures of moral categories. In the post-Babel existence, human moral differences emerged with cultural manifestations that Epiphanius presented in a euhemeristic fashion. He writes that people affected by Scythianism turned their deceiving sorcerer rulers into gods and honored their tombs, made gods by worshipping Akinakes, and moreover, that Scythian Sauromatai created gods by their worship of Odrysos, and the ancestor of the Thracians, the eponymously dubbed Thera. So in the 4th century, and especially in a macro-heresiological exposition by a Christian writer, it should perhaps be no surprise if the ethnonyms and details of religious customs between Thracian and Scythian groups had become so unmoored from their earlier signifieds, so as to enable a vision where customs stemming from the Scythian age are exemplified by the stereotypical Thracian custom of ancestor worship. It is also very interesting to see that the already very well established and fully Herodotian idea of Scythians constructing wooden piles topped with swords as their shrines to Ares had morphed through its long transmission into a more general idea of Scythian northerners creating their own gods in an impious or heretical act of hybris. But we did see, of course, something like this already starting to happen in Lucian. The final passage in your handout, and do I now have the right slide? I seem to do, represents a more positive assessment of Zalmoxis as a philosopher ruler. In the highly interesting and synthetic take on the early Gothic history in his Getica, Jordanes writes how in their second home, that is the countries of Dacia, Thrace, and Moesia, Zalmoxis reigned, whom many writers of annals mention as a man of remarkable learning in philosophy. And so forth. The long-standing confusion, by Jordanes' time quite conventional, between Goths and Getae actually allowed him to use Zalmoxis, as well as in fact all the rest of the Getic history, including Decainas, as a proof of the old history of Goths and as a materias gloriae for them. From the Herodotian stressing of dynamics, which almost look like counterfeit emic notions of a more advanced encounterer being deified by a more rudimentary society, Zalmoxis had emerged as a figure to point out how the barbarians receiving his doctrines were Grecis paine consimiles. No deception, no misunderstanding, or indeed superstitiousness there. Now, to provide some sort of conclusion, I do find this sort of papers focusing on reception rather difficult to conclude, really. Only, not only because we've been galloping through such a number of passages, but also due to the manifold different uses into which Zalmoxis was put. But I will try to offer some kind of observations about the differences and similarities of these later reworkings in comparison with Herodotus' original passage. I don't know if that is the most constructive thing to do, but anyway. All of them are not, of course, necessarily directly dependent on Herodotus, even if it does seem quite convincingly argued that the figure of Zalmoxis did enter the tradition solely through the histories. But the ancient tradition about Zalmoxis and the way he was used to discuss and conceptualize the Thracian and later also other northern peoples' beliefs do foreground with very notable consistency the same motifs which are already quite central to the Herodotian story, with a few exceptions, of course. A couple of things seem to also be forgotten or drop out from the tradition. The way in which Herodotus' Thracians draw their conclusions from Zalmoxis' deception could perhaps be compared with Imperial era references to barbarian interpretatio. Interpretationes are already present in Herodotus' writings on Thracians, which relied on the existing classical Greek iconosphere about Thracian tendency to treat Greek gods disrespectfully and violently, something which was particularly carried on in the mythological narratives and drama. But this interpretative mind reading of the barbarians was already part of Thracian imagery before Herodotus, at least if we choose to read it this way, Xenophanes of Colophon's relativist takes on the divine representations resembling ethnically stereotyped peoples themselves. Yet the Thracians' own belief in Zalmoxis is presented as an ambiguous cultural addition that, despite its massive societal and cultural influence, especially the Getic belief in immortality and their consequent bravery, was based on a ruse that presumably could not have succeeded in a less primitive society. During the subsequent reception of the story, however, the Thracian beliefs that result from Zalmoxis, though largely unchanged as beliefs, are increasingly presented to be as intended by Zalmoxis. The elaboration or involution of the Zalmoxis story seems to have gotten underway by the Hellenistic era, and although the remains of the Hellenistic doxography can be frustratingly complex, it seems to me that the first reduplications of Pythagoras' and Zalmoxis' stories, such as Hermippus' reference to Pythagoras' underground house, may stem from this stage indeed. Herodotus' structurally fairly straightforward story of materially and epistemically superior insider turned outsider turned god, using the Thracians' innate propensity to religious overreactions became less clearly a story about cultural importation and religious imposture. The group of barbarians thought to have received the doctrine of immortality through Zalmoxis may also have begun broadening at this Hellenistic stage. The late Republican and early Imperial interest in the grip of religious specialists over different peoples obtained different manifestations and perhaps reflected broader concerns of the time. Whether the possibility that Caesar's manipulative druids making Gauls believe in rebirth after death are specifically modeled after Herodotus' Zalmoxis and the later Hellenistic examples of manipulative Thracian leaders instilling freedom from fear on their soldiers by emphasizing their immortality or indeed taking advantage of their desidaimonia, or indeed whether they are just reflect a broader, hazier topos that derived some of the force and currency from having been used by Herodotus, is of course very much open to question. Whether this qualifies as a case of Herodosian reception is thus quite debatable, and I don't want to push the point, as I already said. But possibly it's perhaps sensible to think about as an outer fringe of sort of Herodosian influenced, Zalmoxis influenced ethnographicizingly presented material. In Strabo's take, the Getic lands and Moesia emerged as a land where holy charlatans and little-known sects of priests hold sway, fostering among the inhabitants some quite extraordinary and tantalizingly unique ideas about the human-divine relationship, as well as a sort of religious fanaticism. This area forms perhaps the most strongly Herodosianized near abroad of the Augustan Empire. The religious ethnography of the Thracian microregion was in some ways a closer by and vaguely northern variant of those of Egypt and India. Strabo, who was interested in flavoring his universal cultural geography with interesting foreign customs and miraculous stories, even though he officially condemns marvel peddling, found Thrace a fruitful area for religious and ideological curiosities. The story of Zalmoxis is also presented by Strabo as a forefiguring of the contemporary alliance of King Burebistas and his priestly accomplice Dikaeneus, who continued the tradition of manipulating the gullible Thracians. Lucian too seems to have been quite interested in Zalmoxis, perhaps due to his alertness to different forms of charlatanism, and especially that of a religious kind. Perhaps with the exception of Anacharsis, Zalmoxis did remain in antiquity the best known individual case of a northern holy man or sage, and in addition to his early association with Pythagoras, he went on to attract not only subsidiary characters such as Astraios into his orbit, but also entire peoples. Thracians were an obvious choice, but as we have seen by the time of the heresiological compendium Philosophumena in the 3rd century, Zalmoxis could also be presented as the teacher of Celtic Druids. In fact, when in the centuries following Herodotus, we meet references to a belief in rebirth or reincarnation among the northern barbarians, the doctrine is very frequently localized to among the Celts or Gauls, and from them spread to be later also occasionally applied to the Germans. Indeed, the reception of the beliefs of Herodosian Getae could be seen as one long progression of broadening horizons and ever more capacious ethnicizing attributions. Yet the Thracians too, whether as a collective or via one of their specifically tagged subgroups, became established in lists of wise barbarians, where the Germani, on the other hand, were never ever included. This endurance can largely be explained through their firmly established connections to Zalmoxis and Pythagoras. I would say it was these characters who pulled Thracians towards those listings. And it is this connection which in the end seems to have overridden the idea of simple-minded and easily deceived Thracians. On the other hand, Thracians as an ethnos became also slightly more unmoored from its old epistemic points. It became less relevant as well. The other northern groups were commonly believed to be similarly superstitious, and the creed of Zalmoxis offered a useful way of conceptualizing their supposed fierceness, which in itself was a long-standing image with both ideological and literary dimensions. We see a retroactive reflection of the transfer of immortality beliefs to the broader ambit of northern ethnography, for instance, in Iamblichus's Life of Pythagoras, where Zalmoxis' proselytizing among the Thracians is not only implied to have been disinterested and non-deceptive, but also uncomplicatedly leads to a diffusion of this belief among a vast group of northerners. Zalmoxis, for his part, seems during his long ancient reception generally to have gained respectability, though the option for using him as an exemplar for a manipulative, charlatanish, and undeservedly divinized cult peddler remained an active part of the archive. And I think that was my bit today. I thank you for your patience, and I wait with great interest your comments. Thank you.